Imagine living your normal life. You go to the market, you hear church bells, you talk with neighbors in the street, and within a few months, half the faces you know are gone. This is the story of how the Black Death reached Norway in the 1300s and how it changed the country for centuries. The Black Death was a kind of plague caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It usually spread as bubonic plague, which attacked the lymph nodes, and sometimes as pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs. It moved along trade routes that connected ports from the Crimea to Western Europe. By the late 1340s, Norway was a part of this busy network. Ships sailed in and out of Oslo in the east and Bergen in the west, carrying grain and other cargo. Among the sacks of grain and the wooden barrels were black rats. On those rats were fleas infected with Yersinia pestis. For many years, people thought there was only one way the plague entered Norway: a single ship that came into Bergen in 1349. The old Icelandic Lögmanns Annal, written by Einar Haflidason, says that the Black Death came to Bergen in 1349 with a ship from England, and that from Bergen it spread quickly through the country. Recent research by historian Ole Jørgen Benedictau, published in the journal Collegium Medievale, challenges that one-port story. His work argues that the plague actually entered Norway twice, first in Oslo, then later in Bergen. The first arrival likely happened in the autumn of 1348. A ship from southeastern England reached Oslo. The disease appeared in the city, but the cold winter slowed it down. The outbreak did not explode right away. Winter pushed people indoors and made it harder for fleas and rats to stay active. In the spring of about April 1349, as the weather warmed, the plague in Oslo returned with force. It began to spread along roads and local trade routes. Farmers, traders, and travelers carried it into surrounding districts in eastern Norway. While that was happening, a second deadly arrival was on its way. Around August 1349, a ship from England came toward Bergen, probably into the area around Askøy. The Lögmanns Annal describes this as the ship that brought the Black Death to western Norway. Some later legends even talk about a plague ship drifting into the harbour with a dead crew. Modern historians point out that an unmanned ship steering itself safely into port is very unlikely, but the core of the story fits the written sources. A ship from England, grain cargo, rats, and infected fleas. Once the ship reached Bergen, the disease spread quickly in the crowded harbour area. Bergen was a busy port known as Bjørgvin. Merchants, sailors, and fish traders met there each day. They walked from ship to shore, into warehouses, churches, and homes, carrying the infection with them. By the autumn of 1349, the plague in Bergen was raging. From there it spread northward along the coast, toward Trondheim, also called Nidaros. At the same time it moved south and east, toward other coastal and inland areas. Trondheim felt the impact in that same autumn. Some parts of southern and western Norway, including Stavanger, recorded their first deaths in 1350. The worst months came in the winter of 1349 to 1350. That winter marked the peak of deaths across most of Norway. By then, the disease touched nearly every major region, except perhaps the far north. Some evidence, like the building of new churches in parts of northern Norway, suggests that the most distant northern districts may have escaped the full force of the outbreak or were hit less hard. Historians still discuss how far the disease really reached in the north. What did the plague look like to people on the ground? In towns like Oslo and Bergen, someone might wake up with a fever and chills. Painful swellings, called buboes, would appear in the armpits, neck, or groin. Some victims died within days. Others collapsed suddenly in the streets. Families who tried to care for the sick often caught the disease themselves. Church bells rang over and over for funerals. Priests moved from house to house. Many of them died as they worked. Before the plague, Norway had about 300 priests. After the worst wave, only around 40 were left. Nearly all Norwegian bishops died, except the Bishop of Oslo. People tried to respond with the tools and beliefs they had. They prayed. They burned belongings they thought might carry the sickness. Some fled into the countryside. But infected rats and fleas also moved into barns and storage houses. Travel, trade, and even acts of kindness, like visiting sick relatives, helped the disease spread from one settlement to the next. Modern estimates show how deadly that period was. Traditional readings of the old annals say that about 2/3 of Norway's population died in the Black Death. A medical epidemiological study cited on PubMed, which examined the Icelandic annals and other records, argues that this two-thirds figure is probably too high. That study says mortality in Norway can hardly have been more than 40 to 50%. Even this lower estimate means almost every family lost someone. Broader studies of the Kingdom of Norway around that time, including figures cited on the article Kingdom of Norway, estimate a pre-plague population of about 350,000 people. By the middle of the 15th century, around 125,000 remained. That drop shows how much the Black Death and later epidemics reduced the population. The impact on the countryside was just as deep as in the towns. Around the year 1300, there were about 36,500 farms and about 60,000 households in Norway. By 1520, long after the first plague wave, this had fallen to about 16,000 farms and 23,000 households. Many farms, especially those in high or marginal areas, were simply abandoned. Fields went untilled. Animals wandered without owners. In some valleys, whole communities disappeared. Population levels did not recover quickly. According to the article Black Death in Norway, Norway did not return to its pre-1349 population until more than 200 years later, not until the 17th century. That slow recovery shaped everything from local marriage patterns to how land was used. The plague hit the elite and the church especially hard. As mentioned, almost all bishops died. With about 300 priests shrunk to around 40, churches and local parishes struggled to function. Many positions stayed empty. Religious and political leaders who connected different parts of the kingdom were suddenly gone. This loss fed into a much larger shift. Norway's economic and military strength weakened after the Black Death. With fewer people to farm, trade, and fight, the kingdom struggled to keep up with neighbors. Historians link this decline to later political changes, including Norway's growing dependence on Denmark and its place in the Kalmar Union from 1380 onward. Here is where mainstream belief and recent research do not fully match. For a long time, many people thought of Norway's Black Death story as simple. One ghostly ship into Bergen, 2/3 of the country dead, and a sudden collapse. The picture from recent work is more complex. First, the route. Ole Jørgen Benedicto's dual entry theory, supported by evidence in Collegium Medievale and other studies, shows that Oslo in the autumn of 1348 likely saw plague before Bergen did in 1349. That means eastern Norway had its own early wave connected to trade with southeastern England, not just a single dramatic event in the west. Second, the death toll. The PubMed-cited epidemiological study, which carefully checks the old Icelandic annals against how plague usually behaves, argues for 40 to 50% mortality instead of 60 to 65%. That difference matters. It reminds us that medieval writers sometimes used large numbers to show horror, not to give exact statistics. Third, the spread. The evidence of new church building in parts of northern Norway suggests that not every part of the kingdom was equally affected. This challenges the idea that the Black Death hit every corner of Norway in the same way. Some areas may have suffered less or recovered faster than the traditional story suggests. Even after the main wave of 1349 to 1350, the story did not end. Later centuries saw new plague outbreaks in Norway, with records of quarantine rules and controls still in place into the 1600s, as reported by Norwegian SciTech News. These later efforts to isolate ships and travelers show how long the memory and fear of plague lasted. Today, historians continue to piece together this story using Icelandic annals, like the Lögmanns Annal, local Norwegian records, archaeological finds from abandoned farms, and demographic studies. Public interest remains high, with local museums and programs, for example in Numedal and Hallingdal, sharing stories of how specific valleys faced the Black Death. So how did the plague change Norway forever? Between about 350,000 people before the Black Death and about 125,000 after, the kingdom lost well over half its people over time. The number of farms fell from about 36,500 to 16,000 by 1520. The church went from about 300 priests to around 40. Political power shifted, and Norway later became the weaker partner under Denmark. Yet survivors rebuilt. With fewer people, workers who remained often had more bargaining power. Many moved into better land that had belonged to others before. Old structures of power, already under pressure, continued to weaken. All of this began with infected rats and fleas hidden in grain cargo. carried by ships from England into Oslo and Bergen in the late 1340s. The Black Death in Norway was not just a story of sudden death. It was a long process that reshaped farms, families, the church, and the kingdom itself. If you found this story helpful, consider subscribing for more carefully researched looks at how history really happened, using sources like the Løgmanns Annal, Collegium Medieval, PubMed, Norwegian SciTech News, and detailed studies of the Kingdom of Norway.